Hi guys, here I am again. Okay, we're starting on chapter 20 now. Jessie struggled to stand up and her grin faded. Her head throbbed and her legs ached worse than ever. She remembered how Mr. Neely had told Mr. Clifton that censors knew when Jessie left Clifton, and someone had followed her all the way to Waverly. What if Clifton's men were just letting her escape again to see where she would go? Jessie thought about how the Kaiser's cat, Abigail, always played with mice when she caught them. She'd bat a mouse around in her paws and set it free. Just as the mouse began to scurry away, Abigail pounced again. By the end, the mouse was so battered and terrified, dying was probably a relief. Jessie couldn't let that happen to her. She had to outsmart Clifton's men, but how? And she still had to find someone to help Katie and the other children. But who? Ma had said Mr. Neely would call a board of health and a news conference. Could Jessie call them herself? What were they? How could Jessie call them if she didn't have the number? And what if they turned out to be like Mr. Neely, just pretending to help? Jessie's mind felt scrambled with all the questions. Her legs trembled, maybe from climbing down the wall, maybe from being scared. There was too much she didn't know. She could hear cars zooming nearby, and the buildings around her loomed taller than trees. Indianapolis had made her feel small the night before, when she thought Mr. Neely was on her side. Now that she was scared of him, too, what was she going to do? Whom could she trust? It was all so confusing. Jessie felt like sitting down and bawling for her ma and pa. Like a child, even younger than Katie. Then she remembered something Pa had said. Whenever Nathan or Bartholomew tried to eat a whole slice of bread in one gulp, you bite off more than you can chew. Course you're going to choke. One bite at a time. And that goes for thinking things too, not just food. So, what was the first thing Jessie needed to do? She glanced back at Mr. Neely's building. As long as she stood right outside, he could easily find her when he discovered her missing. She had to get away as fast as she could. Slowly, because her legs hurt so much, Jessie began walking. She dodged behind buildings and turned as many corners as possible, so Mr. Neely and anyone else looking for her would have a hard time following her path. And anyone else looking for her would have a hard... read that already. At first, she thought she'd be trapped in Mr. Neely's apartment complex forever because all the buildings looked the same and she couldn't tell if she was getting anywhere or just going in circles, passing the same buildings over and over again. Then she reached a big street where the buildings were all different and cars zipped by in rows of 6 or 8. Could Jessie get one of them to stop and take her far away from Mr. Neely? If she did, could she trust whomever she stopped for her? Jessie's legs shook more and more with each step. When she stumbled on a twig and half fell, half sat down, she decided to stay there just for a minute. The ground was hard as stone, but Jessie didn't care. You don't need to sit way over there, someone said. I don't bite. Startled, Jessie looked around for the source of the voice. She'd been too tired to notice before. An old woman sat on a bench in what looked to be a 3-sided glass house, only about 2 feet away. Really, the old woman said, you don't have to wait on the sidewalk. There's room in here. That's what the bus company built these for, you know. Jessie stood up because the woman seemed to expect her to. Cautiously, she went over and sat beside the woman. You don't normally ride the bus, do you? The woman asked. No, Jessie said, hoping that was the right answer. I didn't think so. I tell you, the 9 o'clock is always late. Always. That's why my daughter refuses to ride the bus. Not dependable, she says. But I say, no car's that dependable either. Breaks down when you least expect it. Jessie saw that this woman was a big talker, as Mrs. Green back in Clifton. Everyone said Mrs. Green would talk to a stick if no one else was around. Jessie wondered how long she was supposed to sit listening. Oh, there it is, almost on time for once, the woman pointed up the street. Jessie saw a big vehicle stopped about a mile away, with people stepping in and out. The bus was kind of like the school vehicles Jessie had seen back at Clifton, the ones she thought were limousines. Well, the woman said, since you're not a regular, let me ask you this. Do you have exact fare? They'll give you change if they have to, but the drivers don't like it. Say, aren't you a little young not to be in school right now? Jessie was saved from answering because the vehicle pulled alongside the three-sided house. The woman got up. Jessie wasn't sure what to do. "Hurry," the woman said. "Tony's driving. He doesn't wait." "Where's the bus go?" Jessie asked. "Downtown, of course. They all go downtown, and you have to get transferred to go anywhere else in the city. Aren't you coming?" Jessie hesitated. Could this bus be some sort of trap? Could Clifton's men have known she would walk to this intersection? Or could the bus be an easy way to get far away from Mr. Neely's building? Jessie's leg ached so much she decided to take her chances. She followed the woman onto the bus. "I'm Mrs. Tyndale, by the way," the woman said when Jessie settled into a seat beside her. "Would you believe I'm 65? My daughters swear I don't look a day over 40. But you know how the daughters can be. Can be flattering you even when you know it's a lie. She's just jealous because lots of times people think we're sisters. That's when she gets for spending all those hours out in the sun when she was a teenager, slathered in baby oil." Jessie listened only enough to be polite. She wanted to think about what she was going to do when she got downtown, but the bus was even noisier than the bread truck had been, and it made her head ache even worse than before. The bus sped forward and stopped, over and over again. The jerky, rocky motion made Jessie dizzy. She closed her eyes. "Are you tired?" Mrs. Tyndale asked. "Bet you stayed up way too late watching TV. That's what my grandkids always do." Jessie wished Mrs. Tyndale would be quiet. Then, even on the jerky, noisy bus, maybe Jessie could go to sleep. That was what she suddenly wanted more than anything else in the world. But no, Jessie forced her eyes open. She had to get help for Katie and the other sick children. Jessie might be out of danger, but the other children weren't. She looked Mrs. Tyndale over carefully, taking in the woman's frizzy white hair, her wrinkles, and her odd, stretchy-looking green pants and top. Could Mrs. Tyndale help? She didn't look like she knew anything about medicine, but maybe. "Mrs. Tyndale," Jessie said as politely as she could. Her throat was dry and raspy, and she realized she hadn't had anything to drink since the KFC restaurant the night before. She swallowed painfully. "Could you tell me how to find a phone number for some place?" Mrs. Tyndale looked at her puzzled. "The phone number for what? Isn't it in the phone book? Or directory assistance?" "What's that?" Mrs. Tyndale frowned. "Don't they teach you kids anything in school nowadays?" She began talking about dialing 0, or maybe another number that would be in the phone book or on a payphone. Jessie didn't entirely understand, even though Mrs. Tyndale seemed to be recounting every single time she called directory assistance. "And one time when I was at the mall, I had to call my husband because he was late picking me up, and I couldn't remember his work number. It just fell straight out of my head." Jessie waited patiently for Mrs. Tyndale to finish. Outside the bus's windows, the buildings got even taller. Jessie realized the bus had reached downtown now, where almost all the buildings were skyscrapers. Many of the people who had packed the bus's seats and aisles were getting off. A knot of panic tightened in Jessie's stomach. How much longer would it be before Mrs. Tyndale left? And there was so much Jessie still didn't know. Desperately, Jessie interrupted the old woman, even though she would have been spanked in Clifton for such behavior. "Can you tell me what a news conference is?" Mrs. Tyndale blinked. "Where did you grow up, child, not to know that?" Fortunately, she didn't wait for an answer. It's kind of refreshing, though. Most kids your age know more about that kind of stuff than my generation does. "So what is a news conference?" Jessie asked. "Oh, you know, when someone has something they want the whole world to know about, they call them media, all the newspapers and TV and radio stations, and they'll tell them all of them to send the reporters to a certain place at a certain time so they can announce their big news all at once. And then the newspapers print the story and the TV and the radio broadcast it so everyone knows." Jessie tried not to look as confused as she felt. How could such a news conference help Katie and the other children? Jessie couldn't think of a way to ask Mrs. Tyndale without telling her everything. Mrs. Tyndale did sound nice, but so had Mr. Neely. Mrs. Tyndale chattered on. Heartsick, Jessie stopped listening. The bus turned a corner and pulled up in front of the state capitol. It had impressed Jessie the night before, but now she didn't care. "Look, honey," Mrs. Tyndale said, "over by the Capitol, there's some politicians holding a news conference, just like you were asking about. That's where I would hold a news conference, too. if I had anything to announce, right there on the Capitol steps. Then it'd show up real dramatic on the 6 o'clock news. Jessie looked where Mrs. Tyndall pointed. A man stood on the front steps, and a group of other men and women clustered in front of him. Some in the group held strange-looking boxes on their shoulders, kind of like a camera back in Clifton. Others seemed to be writing on their hands or some bits of paper in their hands. The strangeness of the sight scared Jessie, but she made a sudden decision. Nothing was going to make sense to her, so she'd just have to find a phone and do the best she could calling the Board of Health and the news conference. "I'm going to get off here," she told Mrs. Tinsdale when the bus pulled to a stop. "Well, it was nice talking to you, honey," Mrs. Tinsdale said. "If you hold a news conference, let me know so I can watch it." She chuckled as if she had said something funny. Okay, gonna end right there on page 148. See you next time.